Hi, and welcome to Work Together, a podcast brought to you by SocialOptic. SocialOptic offer tools and expertise, empowering organisations to gain critical insights, make informed decisions, and work together better. In this podcast series, we ask experts in their field for their views, thoughts, and advice on topics that we encounter with organisations and leaders, ranging from technology and data science to organisational culture and psychology. Roll intro. On today's episode, we'll be discussing a systems perspective of organisations. Joining Benjamin Ellis is Marie Rattray, PhD, an expert in organisational systems, development and continual learning. Marie explains the concepts of organisations as simultaneous, dynamic and interconnected systems, philosophies like lean and the viable systems model, and how knowledge works in organisations. Let's dive in.
For me, as a viable system, there are 5 things that I should have to be able to do. I need to be able to coordinate, to control, to assess, to look into my environment. Now, all those things apply, and it's like the viable systems model is like a system of Russian dolls.
Welcome to the Work Together podcast. I am joined today by Marie, and I'm gonna dive in because I'm excited to have this conversation. So, Marie, introduce yourself to the listeners for those who might not have heard of you before.
Mm-hmm. Hi there, Benjamin. Thank you so much for having me. Me, Marie Rattray, at a point in my career, I suppose, where many people are thinking of retiring, and in fact, I thought about doing the same thing. But my interest really stems from, say, my doctoral work 25, possibly more years ago, where there was a big shift happening at that point in how work was organised. And in how that work was organised, it was a reintegration of it was a philosophy of work that shifted from traditional managers did the thinking, people on the shop floor were the hands who did. Yeah, that's probably a gross misrepresentation, but that's how it was. And then along comes lean. And lean really was this philosophy that said, actually, continuous improvement and problem solving is everybody's business. It's absolutely everybody's business. And there's a reintegration of learning through doing and thinking continuous improvement. And that for me was a real point of pivot. So that's where I started. And my interest really has been around how do organizations create systems that enable people to be their best, to learn together, and to work in a way that is consistent with continuous improvement. So that can be IT systems, it can be the actual workplace, the physical workplace, it can be, what is it that organizations put in place that creates an environment for performance? Basically, that's it. And so roll forward to now, I was sort of disappointed, I think, to my mind, the power of lean never really, in my way of seeing the world, never really transformed organizations the way I thought it could have and should have. It did piecemeal, but not to the extent that I thought it was going to be. And then particularly the work that I was doing sort of in the 2000s, mid-2000s, where I was working with senior people, and we were doing master's programs, but they weren't courses at all. It was, again, looking at what do you do in work? What do you need to do? Where's the gap? All this sort of stuff. And people were getting academic credit for what they demonstrated they had learned, the skills they demonstrated they learned from what they'd done. You'd think that was obvious, wouldn't you? It's a sort of a pull approach to learning, to education, rather than pushing courses. And I just sort of thought, so much was possible and so little I could see. You know, it was happening in pockets, and then it gets to January 2023, when I'm just about thinking of retiring, and then I read about ChatGPT, and I think, oh my Lord, this is no time to go. Seriously, this is, to my mind, another pivotal point, another point of pivot. Whether organizations take it and use the power of these technologies with what we already know or should already know from old knowledge about creating environments, performance environments. So you've got performance environments and now the tools, the technologies. We have just got huge potential in front of us if we choose to take it.
So I'm going to take some of the different threads and weave them together, and I'm going to weave in some of my context as well. So I think I'm going to come back to lean for a minute, because it's interesting that they're in the developer world and the tech startup world, there's a little bit of familiarity with lean because of things like lean startup, and I think it's worth coming back to that, because that is a form of lean but doesn't necessarily represent lean as it was. And I think very few people have had a kind of introduction to what lean is or understand what lean is about. And I was, I think, somewhat fortuitous in that in my early parts of my career, I got to work with Motorola quite a lot and got introduced to Six Sigma, and that was more around quality management. And then when I bumped into you, a good few decades ago now, it started to make more sense into, oh no, okay, I get what lean actually is and actually is about. Because as I think you would say, lean is it's almost more of a philosophy in a way, isn't it?
It's exactly that. It's not about, it's not about maps or trends or I don't know, techniques, or it is, but it's much, much deeper than that. I keep coming back to it's this philosophy of how we organize for customer excellence. And it's about inclusion. It's about everyone. We all have brains, we all have knowledge, we all have experience, and to waste that is well, to my mind anyway, it's criminal. That was always the appeal to me, and that's why I say I was disappointed, because lean as a philosophy, I felt never really in a whole scale way. This is just my feeling. And as you say, in the developer world, lean and the terminology became something else. So for me, I'm sort of quite simplistic in the sense of, looking at this treasure trove of old knowledge that we have. And really what I'm searching for is first principles, Can they be identified? And I'm saying they can. I'm saying that insight that was gained in a different time, under different contexts, doesn't necessarily mean to say that knowledge is no longer applicable. What can be pulled from it? What can be... but to your point, I'm going off now, to linking back to your point about, the developer experience of lean and the sort of philosophical understanding of lean having been a bit lost along the way. I would agree with that.
And it's, for me, interesting at looking at a lot of the trends of how people view organization and organizational theory and practice at the moment, that the core assumptions of lean and what drove the philosophy. I mean, minimization of waste, in terms of people talk about net zero and those sorts of things, actually at its heart was that thing about, making good use of resources, minimizing the waste and the external impact of things. That was kind of baked into the philosophy. Yeah. And again, we're going back. Right. Mm-hmm. Nearly half a century ago. Exactly. And again, as you mentioned, it was very empowering. It assumed that everybody has knowledge to contribute, and it was a very much assumed and a systems view of business.
Yes.
There's a lot at the moment in the narrative that assumes that an organization is made up of a collection of individuals and magically stuff happens. And so there's a lot of what I call focus on the dots, not on the lines. The focus is on the individuals as opposed to the connections between them. And we're going to come back to that again in a minute. But lean and the knowledge that built up around it were all sorts of kind of systems, theories of business. And again, one of the things I think of is, and it's something we use at SocialOptic, the andon cord is something that we have stolen. And this idea of it's a production line, and if something goes wrong, stop and apply all your resource to it. But this idea that small things can have a really big impact when you look at them at a systems level. Everything's connected. Everybody's dependent on everybody else through the network of the organization. And that idea is a very long way away from current thinking about organizations.
Absolutely. And relationships are so key and critical to all that. Can I speak very briefly about to old, I'm putting to old in inverted commas here, thinkers who really, really influenced me all the way back then? We're talking in the mid-90s, and they were around well before that. Do you mind if I, because they were fundamental, and they're actually, they speak to what you're saying, sort of what is an organization. I found myself very simply saying to myself, what is an organization? What's the process? Actually, I struggled with this for a long time. What's the process? Okay, two people. Russell Ackoff. I just, you stumble upon things, don't you? And he was the first person who I read who made me realize that again, an organization has talked about the simultaneous properties. So he said that if you looked at an organization as a system, on one way you look at it, it's divisible. You can analyze it and cut it up and put bits together, like components. Looked at a different way, functionally, i.e. what it does in practice. It's dynamic, it's connected, it's interconnected. At that time, I hadn't really got into any knowledge of complexity, but the notion of emergence, it's not divisible. In motion, it's interconnected and it flows. So that was Russell Ackoff. The second person was Carol Weick. And I absolutely, again, I stumbled upon this. It was just a question. I was in the library. I started looking. I thought, what am I going to do for this wretched doctor? I have no idea. Get to the sort of bookshelves where I think I'm sort of going to look at organizations, organizational design, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, pick out this wee book, and it's only tiny, but I still read it, and I still find things that I didn't see, 25, 30 years ago. And it's called The Social Psychology of Organizing. And in the social psychology, he talks about processes as flows. And in this flows, he talks about viscosity and different rates of movement and movement going backwards and forwards. And I just got this vision of movement. And that was my first thought, wow, this is great. And then secondly, the other thing that I found really interesting about it, when you go to the end of the book, he does what I think is a great thing. He says, right, if you take a sort of micro, he said, if you can understand how 9 people work together, you can understand how thousands work together. And I thought, oh, okay. So he says, when you get a dyad, you and me together, you change me, I change you. And our relationship is never static. You've already got the beginning of dynamism in there. Add a third person, he said, that changes the dynamics completely. Okay, so if you've got a third person, dynamics that were there previously, competition, cooperation, power, all sorts of things. The third person changes the distribution and what that looks like. Then he says, if you take 4 people, in theory, and this is without any sort of context at all, you've then got a possibility of stalemate 2 onto 2. Okay, a pair against a pair. And then he goes up and up and up. So you can get pairs and triads. And he says, when you get to 9, you've got the dynamics of 3 triads within and across. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, that's as cool as cool. And that's always stuck with me. So that gave me the grounding of what if I think about organizations. So yes, it's this sets of socially relationships in action. But you also have the environment, the rules, the governance, the regulations, the workplace, the rule, what you can do, what you can't do, all that sort of stuff. And you can map an organisation out, can't you, by looking at it and saying, well, so and so, sort of value flows, if you like. That's the sort of Russell Ackoff's. You can look at something and divide it, but then in action. So these two thinkers were absolutely fundamental for me. It's just like, yes, they're simultaneous. They're simultaneously dynamic, complex, emergent, interconnected, flows, and at the same time, you can look at it another way where you can say, well, that department talks to that department, and yeah. Anyway, so I found those two really, really influential in my early thinking about organizations, organizational design, learning, how organizations work, all of that.
So I'm going to take us to 2008 in that case, and that era, plus or minus, I don't know, 5 years max, was really when what at the time was often called social software, kind of predating social platforms, started to come into play, and people got to interact digitally in the workplace, which was a whole new concept and kicked off a whole new set of thinking. So let's explore that, because it's surfaced a whole set of things which I think organisations are only just coming to terms with now, aren't they, really?
Absolutely. Okay, that's really, so around about that time as well. I think you and I maybe started to get to know each other round about then, 2008, 2009, thereabouts, through the Johnson Controls conversations that I used to do with a colleague, where we would get senior IT, facilities, workplace, anyone who'd got anything to do with work, getting together for big conversations, and we'd have a topic. One of the topics that we addressed was, one of the sessions was knowledge management and enterprise social networking. And in the course of doing that, what came out of the conversations that we convened was just the strength of knowledge and information gets passed around in the informal social networks that we all have, both online and in person. And that sort of linked for me back to Russell Ackoff, looking at the sort of simultaneous properties of organizations. And one of the huge simultaneous properties is formal and informal. Yeah. And at that time, in preparation for this particular session, I remember finding a McKinsey paper. And this McKinsey paper was really saying that social networks were sort of dangerous because they could not be controlled. The majority of information in organizations, according to their research in this particular paper, which I can source for you, they were saying, but it flies underneath the radar of management. It flies under management radar. Poof, it was so around that time. I think the realization of informal networks. It was known before. I'm not saying that this was a new realization. It wasn't. We all know it. Anybody who's ever worked for 5 minutes in an organization knows that. But I think with the digital, that sort of really did it reveal? I don't know if it did, but anyway, we now had a new way of informal conversations to happen, as well as the face-to-face by your desk. I wheel my chair over to you, and we have a chat about what we're going to do about this. And I think what I found interesting, and by the way, anything that I'm talking about here is very partial and it's very personal. I'm not suggesting this is that this is the be all and the end all of everything, because other people have come to similar realizations using different references. There's a diversity of approaches. This is just my sort of personal journey, if you like. So then we move on to about 2010, and Professor Alex Pentland, he was at MIT in the human dynamics school, and he wrote a book called Social Physics. And what he did was he asked volunteers to wear badges that censored movement and tone of voice and goodness knows what else. And he collected huge data sets on how information was passed around. And blow me down, what would you know? Informal networks. That is exactly in organizations how information's passed around. Now, the digital element of it, I'm not entirely sure that I can speak to that, with any great experience, because fundamentally humans talk to each other, whether it's face to face or whether it's online. And I wonder sometimes if online, again, speaking from my own, I censor myself, I say things to people in person that I would never say online for various reasons. I'm going to be challenged. I'm going to be told I'm a fool, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a psychological safety around sharing and saying something. I think this is my experience. So that's why I'm saying that I personally don't feel like I can speak to that because, just because. But yes, so I think there was something very fundamental going on around that time that really pointed to, from various sources, pointing to informal relationships and dynamics in the workplace as being the major conduit for knowledge and information being passed around.
And to layer some of the digital domain on that, at that point in history, I was very much into a technology called wikis, which was like a very...
Oh, that's right, yeah.
A way of really linking information and capturing it in a very informal way, and what were called folksonomies, which was a way of letting people classify and group things, but in a very emergent fashion. So rather than sitting down and trying to get the final right answer, you let people categorize things and saw what structures emerged from that to help you understand what was going off. But one of the things that hit me about those conversations was the intentionality of workplace design that I had been blissfully unaware of up until that point, even though my very earliest career kind of started with some responsibility for facilities. Actually, for the first time, really understanding that the intentional placement of rooms and physical structures in a building had an impact on how knowledge was shared and how knowledge was moved around. And then much later on, as I started to work with the pharmaceutical sector, which is very innovation driven, they're incredibly conscious of how you design your office to make sure that you get those informal collisions, because that's where for them value gets created, those accidental conversations. Like pretty much every major breakthrough has been from an accidental conversation, even if it was one that was created by building some structure. Anyway, to the digital domain, an interesting thing right now, a lot of what we're working on is things like closed culture and identifying early on and preventing structural organizational failure. So what that looks like is in healthcare, where you get closed cultures that has an impact on patient care. When you look at the finance sector, that has an impact in terms of, if you look back through the current history of financial failures, those were all cultural failures.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually a lot of that stuff comes from what you talked about, that aspect or dimension of psychological safety that can be missing in the digital domain. And in fact, the root cause of some of these things is the fact that where people have been restricted just to operating online in one channel in a very formal way, the informal conversations, the speaking up and the challenging that are required to keep a culture healthy don't happen. And that just as you have to be intentional with the physical office design for organizations that have gone hybrid or, choose your favorite word, virtual, offline, remote, you have to be intentional about building in the structures for that informal conversation, recognizing that informal communication, as I think it's something you've always said, is really essential for keeping the organization functional. It's not, it's not idle chit chat. It's not just social glue. It's actually part of the outer structure around the process. And so I'm going to throw in the viable systems name here. So in that theory where you have things and you have control structures and you have processes, and again, these can be very informal. It's not processes in the ISO sense, it's just this is how things work. You have these outer loops, and one of the most important, biggest outer loops is that relationship between people in the organization, which actually is one of the expressions of the culture of an organization, how people relate together. Back to that idea of, if I can see a team of 9 people, I know how this organization works. That way of interacting is actually essential for the health of the organization, and in a regulated industry, essential for the proper function of that as a regulated organization, because it's those outer loops, things driven by people feeling safe to speak up, which actually preserve the health of the organization and making sure that it's doing what it needs to do in the right way.
Okay. Yes, to all that. I think so you and I have talked long about the viable systems model. I'm a fan. My initial interest, so a system can be me, it can be you, it can be the two of us together, it can be, you define the boundaries around what a system is. It can be a team, it can be a department. To remain viable, a system has to be able to withstand shocks coming at it from the external environment. What I found is a really esoteric, the diagram just gave you a sore head. Do you know what? The first time I came across it, I got it instinctively. And then I read the words. And when I read the words, I thought, I can't possibly have understood this. And I put it down. And it was about a full 6 months before I went back to it again. And I thought, actually, I do get it. Essentially, what I found interesting is that it's a set of, a set of, again, principles. This is my view of it. People can take issue with me, but this is how I see it. That for me, as a viable system, there are 5 things that I should have to be able to do. I need to be able to coordinate, to control, to assess, to look out into my environment, to look into my environment, and I need to do all these things. Now, all those things apply, and it's like the viable systems model is like a system of Russian dolls, where systems are embedded within systems, but they're not embedded. They actually talk across and link across. But the reason that I found it interesting is that this was the first time that I saw something where I saw, so if I'm interested in empowerment, people making autonomous decisions, it's really a way of saying, if these mechanisms are applied, and there's a big if here, because it's not saying that people function like this. Of course they don't. But theoretically, it demonstrates how it might be possible to have maximized local control of action and decision with centralized coordination. So we're back to simultaneous properties again, really, aren't we? And for me, that was the attraction of the viable system model. It has been severely criticized. It's very seldom seen in practice. But again, this is all just my view. But I still think, for me, there are principles within that can be taken, pulled out, extracted, interpreted for the context, because the context becomes everything. The context is first and foremost, what are we looking at? What do we think we know? What do we not know? Get the shape of what we think our world looks like from our own vantage point, from the point of view of being a one person, a two person, a three person, a team, a whatever. Moving away from the critique and the criticisms of whether it's still relevant or not still relevant, I personally think that there are insights contained within this very formalized set of processes that says if you do this, you do that, you do that, then this is possible. It is possible to have autonomy with simultaneous coordinated control and flexing and changing among the different components, the different elements that make up the overall viable system. And the viable system can be the organisation. It can be the organisation in an ecosystem, because, of course, now organisations don't function on their own. If you look at healthcare, we've now got these ecosystems of independent but connected organisations, all sharing expertise, all sharing knowledge, resources, finances, you name it, to be able to produce something, to bring something to the healthcare market. I remember listening to, it was Philips. Philips had, I'll dig it out if you're interested. It was a reflection between two people about how Philips had changed from being sort of product focused to being eco, driven by the relationships among, we would have called it all those years ago, supply chains. It's not a supply chain, it's a supply network, all the components. Anyway, so that's the viable system. You can go down rabbit holes with this. You really can. But I tend to see it quite simplistically.
It's a useful structure, I think. And one of the other things that, I think, thinking back to that kind of window around 2010 and as social software came in and digital collaboration, there was this view that pretty much wasn't much more complex and hierarchy's bad, flat network structure's good. And it's interesting that just of late I've seen that coming around again. It's like, if we move from a hierarchy to a network, all of our problems will go away. At which point you kind of go, well, no, there's half a century of theory that tells you that you're going to have a worse problem that you started with. And again, it isn't a dichotomy; it's a false either or between those two things, that both can coexist. Because if you have network without the hierarchy, actually your power structures are uncontrolled. There isn't accountability. That it doesn't create psychological safety. There's a whole set of reasons, but it isn't the case that if you have a very hierarchical system, that doesn't mean that the decision making is devolved and that people are autonomous.
I think as you were speaking there, Benjamin, I was thinking, if there are younger people, who just at the beginning of their career listening to this, I think for me, the value of many of these old approaches, old thinking, old insight, is about the conversations that it starts. What do we think we look like? What do we think is going on? Again, it's back to the context. And what light, if anything, can these old thinkers shed on how we move forward, how we understand where we're currently at and the steps that we're going to put in place to move forward? Not in a predictable way, but in a way that, and that brings us into, another area that could get us into hot water. To me, it's valuable it's the conversations. This is what, say, the viable system model says. Is it relevant? Is it not relevant? If it's not relevant, then why not? Is it useful? If it's useful, why not? To me, there's a sort of big carpet bag of stuff, really, isn't there, that we've collected over the years in terms of frameworks and theories and research, which of course has been superseded and built upon, and all of this sort of stuff. But really and truly, I've always seen myself, in a sense, like Mary Poppins, with a big carpet bag. Full of things. And when I was working, sort of moving on into the 2010, 12, 14, moving later, and that sort of brought me into work-based learning and so forth. My view was always sit down with a team, and nobody's more of an expert in their own cultural and operational context than the person or the team that you're working with. As an outsider, I can ask nosy questions. As an outsider, I can be a provocateur. As an outsider, I don't have to bear the responsibility. Well, I do have to bear the responsibility, but really what I'm saying is that the expertise lies with them. And it's then a question of, right, here we go, we've got this bag of tricks, and here's something that I think you may be interested in. And the responsibility then is for them to say, well, actually, that is useful or it's not useful. And again, we're back to, why is that? So is the conversations and the reflections are around, what are the pressures? What is it we're trying to do? What are the pressures? What's going to stop us? What are the constraints? What are the enablers? How do we move forward? And these tools, the old knowledge, the old insights, the old theories become sort of social objects, really, don't they? They become things that provoke conversation and insight. And I think this brings us right all the way now up to the fear around ChatGPT, because I feel myself that this is, what we're now offering. There's stuff that can be taken, and because what does ChatGPT know about the context that you're working in? What does it know about your relationships? What does it know about the people that you're working with? What does it know about, all of that? And therefore, to take something that's a starter for 10, if you remember Bamber Gascoigne, an old reference. Yes, it was an old program on television. But, so you take that as your starter for 10, and then you say, we'll build on it, we amend it. Is it useful? Is it insightful? And I see this accumulation of old knowledge and old philosophies, or philosophies that never really got off the ground. Maybe now is the time to take them out and re-examine them for their utility and insightfulness, for helping us understand where we are and move forward.
There's a phrase in the data science world that predates it, which is all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think, that applies to theories. They can be a really useful lens for having a discussion about what's going on. Yeah. And that pivots nicely, I think, into I think a general misunderstanding of how knowledge works that I think ChatGPT has really surfaced, in that in a workplace where a lot of people have known nothing but the workplace being digital, and that, what we're looking at now, we're looking at nearly 2 decades where that's been pretty much the case. There is a misunderstanding that knowledge is what exists on the hard drive.
Correct.
And I was trying to explain it to somebody this week, and my explanation was, it's a little bit trying to, they're saying, well, look, ChatGPT could read all these, the conversation logs from Teams and the email threads, and it can, it will have all of the knowledge of the organization, and it can operate on it. And those people listening, Marie's shaking her head furiously. And it's a little bit like saying, well, I've captured all the exhaust fumes from my car, and so now I'm going to be able to make a car because I understand them. It's like, well, no, what you've got there is the exhaust fumes, and there's a lot of different things kind of come together. So I think one of the things in Lean that was implicit, but I don't think ever explicitly stated, was the idea that knowledge is a social thing. And that takes a second to get your head around, because we've all been taught knowledge is what's in your head, and you do exams on knowledge. And
that's not knowledge. Anyway, yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Benjamin.
It's that thing, particularly your perspective around organisational learning, is the fact that knowledge isn't a passive thing, and that it doesn't, whilst it does exist in people's heads, that's not where it's operable, for want of a better word.
Also, it has a shelf life. It has a real shelf life, doesn't it? When I started a couple of years ago, I started researching just for my own nosy sake around this whole skills agenda. And there was a paper that I read. This is in 2017. Universities UK, the body that represents, I don't know, it was 126 or however many universities it is, and they were looking at the skills that, you know, in general, people are going to have as technology presence, just before what we know about ChatGPT and so forth. And one of the things that this paper said was that if you start a 3-year degree, by the time you finish it, your technical knowledge is going to be out of date. So, which begs the question, and there's a couple of things going around in my head. Information and knowledge are two different things. And information is what we get, isn't it? And then we contextualize it and it becomes knowledge. And I see knowledge as know how, know who, know why. You know, so it's and that, I think, you know, we now have information. You know, the information hose has been there for, you know, ever since we've had search, but knowledge applied, knowledge of your know who, knowledge of your, you know, your colleagues, your customer, your, you know, the social dynamic, know who, know why, you know, what are you doing this for, you know, and this sort of brings me around, so know who, know how, know why. Sort of brings me around to so the skills agenda, because I've always been really, really frustrated in the sense that, say a university education, and I heard somebody the other day there on LinkedIn saying that artificial intelligence can now be used so that we can now super quickly create courses. Oh, for goodness sake. No question of standing back and saying, wow, with this potential, how can we think differently? How can we be differently? You know, how can we use these things to augment what we are capable of? Now, again, I fell into doing executive education at a university, and this was an entirely different way. There was nothing about courses. So we go into a company that got a strategic thing it needed to do. And so you go through the steps of, you get a team of the people inside the organization, someone from the university, and you get this team. And really, essentially, you'd say, what is it you need to do in scoping out a direction that you're going to move in. In order to be able to do that, if you look, and you know, everybody who's done either a bachelor's or a master's degree at a UK university, I'm only talking about the UK because that's all I know about, there's a grid that has been determined at national level, and every university takes it and reinterprets it for their own courses. And essentially, it's open source. Anybody can have a look at it, and it's all around skills for complexity. You know, what you're able to do, critical thinking. How are you going to decide when you have difference? So you have a situation, and there are several ways that you can choose to go, and they're all conflicting, and you don't have enough information, and you have to make a decision, and you probably have to do it double quick time. What skills are you needing to be able to do that? And that's why you go to university. You go to university to develop skills to be able to think and act in complex contexts. That is what it's all about. And it just frustrates the life out of me that we still have people now saying that we can use artificial intelligence to create courses. Now, I'm not saying that courses are useless. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that the whole reason for going to university, where after 3 years in the current context, your technical knowledge may well be out of date by the time you finish. So what else is there? What else is there is the skills that you've developed to be able to evaluate, think critically, make decisions, make choices, defend them. That's where it's all. And this, I think, hopefully, and this is why I want to get back into the game. This is why I don't want to retire, because I now think that with the tools that we've got at our disposal, we can now shine a light all away from courses and onto these skills that are already out there, that for higher thinking. It's social skills, it's creative skills, it's thinking skills, it's decision skills, it's doing it at speed, it's working with paradoxes. It's working with gaps. It's working with how do you trust the information that's in front of you? And that has been problematic for a long, long time, really, isn't it? Those, I hope that the technologies and the direction that we go in now start to steer general attention towards these in the moment, together, thinking, creative, doing skills.
I'm going to tie that back up with a real life story that probably weaves these threads together, and I think particularly for that relationship between learning and experience and culture in organizations. And there was some work done looking at a particular systemic failure in a regulatory structure. And one of the observations from that is like looking at, well, what went wrong? Why did that happen? And it was through the transition around COVID. And what had happened was the meetings were done on Teams, and that's great, or choose a platform of your choice. It wasn't specific to Teams, but they were done online, and then people hung up. And that was that. Whereas pre-pandemic, people would go into the meeting together, they would come out, and the senior member of staff would talk to junior member of staff, say, hey, did you see this? Did you see that thing? Or they could challenge them and say, oh, you behaved in like a strange way there. Or this thing happened and I didn't notice it. Was that important? And those, again, informal conversations were where A, knowledge creation happened, and B, were the experiential learning that enabled those people to develop. And also the other failing that happened was it also needed to have a culture where those conversations could happen, where there were those relationships across the different levels, sometimes between somebody talking to somebody 4 levels above them in the organization. So it was an interesting story that brings all of these things together. It's like, actually, you need the right cultural surrounding, the opportunities for those experiences of learning, and the important knowledge isn't what's in the pages and pages of documentation. It's actually that interaction between what's in people's heads that creates the value.
Absolutely. And actually, well, I read something a while back that said that your idea that's in your head, it is only an idea. And when it's brought out in conversation, it's brought out and shaped. It's brought out and shown, and somebody else will say, what will add to it, or, and between you, that's it. So the knowledge has to be brought out, and it has to be spoken. It has to be, it has to be communicated and knocked around and tried and experimented with and so forth. Yeah, absolutely.
Exciting times. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Emery. Thank you very much for your time, and really excited to see what you get up to next. And thank you for the learning over the years and for sharing your knowledge today as well.
Oh, Benjamin, no, thank you. I'm delighted to just to have another one of our chats of old, if you like. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Work Together, a podcast brought to you by SocialOptic. If you aren't already subscribed, search for SocialOptic Work Together on your favourite podcast service. And if you found it helpful, don't forget to help others find the podcast by giving it a rating, leaving a review, and telling others about the show. You can find more from SocialOptic on our website, socialoptic.com. If your organisation would benefit from data-driven decision-making and desire to work better together, then get in touch through the chat box on our website. Drop us an email or give us a call. We'd love to hear from you. You can also read more on our blog, where we explore more of the themes we discuss on the podcasts. This podcast was hosted by Benjamin Ellis and produced by me, Chris Trim.